All right, welcome everyone. This is, just change, there we go. This is the webinar on body shape versus body shape, body weight versus body shape. And what we're going to talk about how body shape is actually one of the most important indicators, much more so than weight, in terms of what's happening internally. Now, my name is Dr. Sam Shay. I'm a chiropractor. I'm an Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner, as well as a Kalish Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I have a bunch of other degrees and everything. I used to be a functional neurologist. I have an acupuncture degree as well, and had a very long circuitous route to the kind of natural health, functional medicine mutt cross training that I am today. And I specialize in helping health-minded entrepreneurs, mompreneurs, and leaders find optimal health in their bodies. Now, obviously, if you're not an entrepreneur or a mom, I'm more than happy to help you as well. I find that the reason I specifically work towards working with moms and entrepreneurs, because you help mom, you help the family, you help entrepreneurs, you help society. So that's kind of the reason why I'm in this, is I want to scale my efforts to a much larger global community. Now, I want to thank all of you for taking the first step to discovering some hidden health secrets that lie within your body shape. I know we've all been exposed to all sorts of different things, podcasts, television specials, newspapers, magazines, etc., that all tout this thing or the other. And my intention is to share with you what's really practical and what's very doable. Now, you're probably here because you're curious and you've dealt with things like you've been doing all the right things, you've been focusing, but you're still struggling to reach your goals. You're hooked on the scale, and nothing's really fun, and it's all confusing. So again, I wanted to invite people who are joining us. Please put questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to address them later on. And Crystal, my business manager, you heard her voice in the beginning. She will be here to gather and organize your questions. And then everyone's got all their cameras off. That's great. Now, at the very end, there's going to be a very special announcement. There's a really big announcement in terms of how you can now learn how to really take control of your body shape and body weight in a meaningful and enduring way. So we're going to talk about the top reasons why your body shape is so telling, and we're going to debunk the myth why the scale is misleading, and how to zero in on your natural wiring through genetic lab testing. And the phrase is test, don't guess. And as a very as a reality check, this is a very difficult topic that people have been struggling with for a very long period of time. And so for a bit of levity rather, this is a picture of my wonderful dog, Lily. This is her staring at me, wondering why I'm taking a photo of her instead of feeding her. And so this is the look I get of the, why aren't you feeding me right now? Look, with her ears back and everything. She's a wonderful rescue Frenchie. So what does your body shape tell you about your internal health landscape? So we've got several different shapes. We've got pear, and this is the estrogen dominance. So basically, if you imagine a pair of people who have estrogen, women who have estrogen dominance, what they have is typically a lot of weight. It's like a thin torso, but a wider, like it's all on the hips. And that main culprit is estrogen dominance. Then we have the apple shape. And this is the inflammatory metabolic syndrome, where you hold the weight. It's kind of the reverse of the pear shape, where you have your chest really expands outward. And it's not really defined waist, but there's a real kind of like expansion. And you see this is from inflammatory metabolic syndrome. And what happens is that there's a large amount of visceral fat that's built up around, that's caked around the organs. And what happens is that that visceral fat actually expands and starts to push out from the inside and expand the stomach and the torso and the rib cage out. So that's what the apple shape is from. It's metabolic syndrome and inflammation. So we're going to talk a bit more about inflammation later on, but metabolic syndrome is it's complicated, but basically you're not able to properly regulate how you are storing and dealing with calories. And it's this combination of blood sugar disorder, inflammation, et cetera. And you start caking on internal fat as opposed to external fat. And you begin to swell from the inside out as opposed to layer fat from the outside going in. So that's the apple shape. Then we've got the rectangle shape. And this is more adrenal. And this adrenal, now there can be different stages of types of adrenal shape. Like, a lot of people can have it kind of start around the belly and the midsection, but as you'll see later on with the liver shape is more the belly protrudes forward, where the adrenal, where it kind of goes all the way around. So the rectangle shape, what happens is that the adrenal glands create weight, and it's starting mostly around the midsection and then kind of distributes. And the reason why it's around the midsection first and kind of creates this rectangular phenomenon is that if you are under adrenal stress, chronic stress, and adrenals are there to help us survive in acute situations. Like we have, hundreds of thousands of years, a million years of evolution, depending on where you want to pick your starting point. And what happens with the adrenal glands is that if you're under chronic stress, now back as hunter-gatherers, back in the day as hunter-gatherers, the only real forms of chronic stress were threat of chronic starvation or the threat of chronic war of a neighboring tribe. So under chronic stress, you start to layer fat around your midsection because if you're at risk of chronic starvation, you want to hold on to create as many long-term storage calories as possible in the form of fat. And you want to store it in a way that doesn't jeopardize your ability to sprint after food or away from predators, or to walk long distances to forage and find new food sources. So where would you carry weight that would enable you to walk the longest distances as well as free up your shoulders and hips to sprint? And that's around the stomach. You look at sumo. Sumo wrestlers are very fast in very short distances. And because even if someone's extremely large, they can sprint. So you'd want to have the weight in the center of mass if you were under chronic stress and needed to be able to sprint after food or away from predation or walk long distances. And that's why the adrenal glands store around the gut, and then that can kind of diffuse and create this rectangular shape. Now, there's also a phenomenon of retaining water as well, where you have, if your adrenals are weak, you have cortisol, which is a hormone from the adrenal glands. Cortisol is the major inflammatory control hormone in the body. So if you have poor inflammatory control, that means that inflammation can spread through the body. Now, inflammation is the body's way to deal with inflammation, infection, and toxic chemicals. So inflammatory chemicals are actually dangerous to the cells. And so if they're there to be short-term to deal with infection, inflammation, what is inflammation? If I'm in a hunting party and I'm going after a very large animal with the stick, there's a very large chance I'm going to be bitten, gored, mauled, trampled, etc. And so my inflammation response, if I'm bit, then the inflammation goes in to try to heal the tissue damage from the bite, but also to kill the infections that were just injected into my muscle from what was hanging around in saliva and teeth. Now, so inflammation is a good thing as a short-term process to heal up and repair and kill infections. The problem is that if I'm overly sensitive and genetically overproduce inflammation, then long-term inflammation is really dangerous. And that's what creates a lot of chronic diseases and fatigues and all sorts of other problems. So if you have an inflammatory response you can't control, the body will then retain water to dilute the inflammatory chemicals that harm the cells and tissues. It's a solution to pollution is dilution. So the body will dilute inflammatory chemicals in order to do what? Buy the liver and kidneys time in order to filter out and remove the inflammatory chemicals. So that's why people who have like eat foods that are out of sync with their health, with their genetics, with whatever it may be, what happens is that they can start to create this massive internal wave of inflammation. And that's what I would call, I'd lovingly call like the muffin test, where people, they take a little bite of a muffin and they swell up like 1 to 4 pounds, in the course of a day. And we call that, I call that the muffin test, where if you, it's not, unless that muffin was last year's re-gifted Christmas fruitcake, that muffin didn't weigh 4 pounds. So what happened was that you take the bite of the muffin or anything else that's inflammatory to your system, and your body will then react to whether it's the gluten or the sugar or the preservatives or whatever it is that's in that muffin. It will say, oh, this is really dangerous. So then your body will retain water and create this systemic swelling in order to buy time to filter out all the toxic chemicals, creating that puffy weight. And if your adrenals are weaker, then you will have a harder time controlling that inflammatory response. So that's the adrenal rectangular shape. Then we have the beer belly shape, and that's the fat is protruding forward. That's a liver that's primarily a concern with the liver. So for example, you got a fatty liver. Well, the liver is a very large organ and it's in the front. So as the liver gets bigger, it pushes everything forward, creating that beer belly shape. Some other contributors to that beer belly shape, but the one to focus on for these purposes is the liver. Then we've got the robot shape for the thyroid. Now, I'm chuckling because I really struggle to try to find a schematic of like how can I represent this? And I was like, okay, robot. So the weight is held through the upper body and neck, and that the hips are narrower and legs are thinner relative to like the neck that just gets bigger and just kind of blocky type morphology. And I have many other talks. I've been on a bunch of podcasts, particularly late last year, on thyroid. If you're interested in that, it's like on YouTube, and where I talk about the different types of functional tests that are related to thyroid. If people are concerned about their thyroid, they can't just focus on getting thyroid done. They have to look at adrenals, because adrenals can suppress thyroid. They have to look at gut health, because if the gut is compromised, you can create a kind of a permeability or a leakiness in the gut, and then certain infections and gluten can leak through, and the body will create an immune response, and those immunoglobulins will attack the thyroid as collateral damage when they're just trying to go after the infections or the gluten. But the shape of the gluten in those infections is similar enough in shape to thyroid tissue that it attacks the thyroid. So you may have a gut issue creating a thyroid issue. You may have what's called a mitochondria issue. Mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell. The thyroid, you may have low thyroid, not because the thyroid is necessarily the culprit, but the target of the thyroid, the mitochondria, is broken. So the thyroid makes T4 and T3. T4 is the car that drives the engineers called T3 over to the cells. The T4 gets to the mitochondria, which is the factory. T3 is the engineer, pops out of the car to then turn on the dials and flip the switches of the electricity factory, the mitochondria, to turn on the mitochondria, to turn on the electricity factory to do what? To burn protein, fats, and carbs in the presence of oxygen to generate energy. This is what's called your basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is the amount of energy your mitochondria burn by consuming protein, fats, and carbs and burning them in the presence of oxygen. So the mitochondria is the business end of the thyroid. So if you have a thyroid issue, particularly if you show a thyroid, all the, bunch of signs of thyroid problems, but your thyroid levels are quote unquote normal, it may not be a thyroid issue, it may be the factory, which the thyroid is trying to act on. Then there's other things like estrogen dominance can affect thyroid, suppress it, and iron deficiency and some other things. But thyroid's a much bigger discussion, and there's a whole separate talk devoted to that. So we've got all these different shapes where people can manifest, like that's their body shape. And then there's things that can happen in their life where it's like, well, how does that look like aside from the change in body shape? So for the estrogen types, the pear shapes may have irregular or painful PMS or period cycles. For the apple shape, this is the metabolic syndrome, that you don't have a body definition because, well, you don't have a body definition because the fat is growing from the inside out. It's not changing from the outside in like you'd normally expect from a gyn. And then the rectangular shape, that's the eat one little thing and gain 3 pounds overnight or even during the day. I mean, that's the muffin test that I described. You've got here the liver shape that you may be overweight, but not necessarily look at. I mean, you will at the end stages. For people with thyroid issues, they've also got concerns around mood and energy levels. And scales are frustrating because no matter what you're doing for exercise, etc., like it's not really making a dent because we're dealing with different phenomenon here. And you've got all these different diets that are convincing you or attempting to convince you to do something. So, and it's not working. So then there are different types of weight gain. We touched on a couple of them, and these are, so that there's the body shapes, and then there's the type of weight. So there's the inflammatory water weight, which we talked about before, that you get inflammation, and then the weight will come from water retention. Then there's hormonal toxic weight, and this is weight where it's difficult for your liver to detox hormones when they're past their due. Like you can get estrogen dominance because your liver is having trouble detoxing estrogen, or you have toxic chemicals or toxic metals that interfere with the thyroid or interfere with the ovaries. And that the last type and the least common method for large and rapid weight gain is actually calorie fat weight. Most people think this is the most common cause. It's the least common. Most of the weight that I see is inflammatory water weight, and then it's a combination of inflammatory hormonal toxic weight, then it's hormonal toxic, and then it's calorie fat weight. Inflammatory water weight, that's by far the most common thing that I see. So it's not all weights the same, and each body shape maps more commonly to one or the other. So for example, metabolic syndrome involves a lot of inflammation, which creates more fat from the inside out, screwing up the liver, making the liver inflamed. Liver can show up in all of these. Adrenal can weak adrenals can promote more inflammation. Adrenal is the hormone realities of having a hormone imbalance can affect the adrenal glands as well. Thyroid is affected by hormonal, et cetera, et cetera. So you see how like there's different mappings of the types of body shapes and then the types of weight. Now, the only way to know for sure which type of weight gaining you are is to test, not guess. And then what we need to do is find data on what your body actually wants and needs. And so we really, really want to look at genetics as the foundational layer of determining what your diet should be. And thankfully, we now have technology in order to really, really investigate what you can do to figure out which of these weight gainers you are at, which one of the weight gainers you are. So when it comes to blood sugar dysregulation and digestion, there's a phenomenon of unknown food triggers. Now, people can assume that, oh, I'm fine with this or I'm not fine with that. But when they actually do genetic testing, they may learn quite a bit. So for example, I am genetically vulnerable to coffee. Now I'll show you in a bit more detail in a minute, but I'm actually quite vulnerable genetically to coffee. And I didn't really know that, or, well, I kind of knew it, but I didn't really take it seriously until I actually got my genes tested. So a little bit more on that later. There could be unknown food triggers that can cause blood sugar dysregulation and digestion. There can be causes of dietary inflammation. If you're eating outside your carb tolerance window. So people may be eating super healthy, organic, soaked, then cooked quinoa, soaked and sprouted, but it's still maybe too much for their genetic tolerance. This is what happened to me. I had the most Portlandia Mediterranean diet ever. I knew the farmers, the chickens. I had it completely clean, and the quinoa was grown by these, it was just this perfect quality diet, but the quality wasn't the issue, it was the quantity. And when I got my genetics tested and I realized that I had the second lowest carb tolerance you can have, the genetic carb tolerance of like an Inuit, it's within 1 week of changing my diet, my digestive problems of over 20 years went away. I had terrible indigestion, bloating, embarrassing kind of lethal gas that would like melt paint, kill flies in empty yoga rooms. All went away in a week when I finally switched my diet away from, Mediterranean down to a very low carb for me specifically, because that was my particular genetic result. I'm not saying everyone is that. And I know for a fact they're not all that, because I do these genetics tests and not everyone is a paleo or a keto or thing. Some people are Mediterranean, and even in the Mediterranean, there's variations of degrees of carb tolerance, and there's even high carb people. So people can have inflammatory responses to eating just too much of a singular type of food, like carbs. Then there's the concept of appetite control and hunger regulation. So if you know your genetic wiring in terms of hunger preferences, you can modify your eating environment and flavor profile so that you will eat better and healthier. I really want to highlight this. People are genetically wired for specific hunger preferences. Now, if you know your genetic realities, if you know your genetic vulnerabilities, then you don't have to, then you can change your eating environment. I'm not saying change your willpower. It's easier to change environment than it is to change your willpower. So you can, once you're armed with the information in your genetics, you can then easily, very easily change things so that you eat healthier and healthier and not struggle so much anymore. Like I had an eating disorder or two growing up. I overate and I was a sugar addict. And if I knew my genetics and my genetic reactions to carbs, my genetic reactions to coffee, I was drinking coffee since 6 years old, true story. Like if I knew my genetics, like I would have saved me so much grief, pain, health problems, and frankly, a lot of social grief as well, because if my digestion was off, it made socializing difficult. So I'm wanting to share with you that the genetics is the secret weapon that everyone has heard about, people have tried to use, but are ultimately confused by, because they're not getting the right type of genetics testing, or if they are, it's drowned out in this giant sea of too much noise and not enough signal. And this, if the more data is not always better data, it's better organized data is better data. And once you have your data and it's organized and it's prioritized and personalized to you, then you can really make the magic happen. So I love data, including this data. I grew up on Star Trek, The Next Generation. He along with, so it's kind of like, I'm on Surprise. I'm a bit on the spectrum. I actually, if you're curious, I do stand-up comedy as a hobby, and I actually have 3.5 minutes on my YouTube channel on what it's like having Asperger's. But Data was one of these cultural heroes that kind of normalized people on the spectrum. And so love this data, but also genetics data, where you actually analyze it. And yes, and I have to thank Crystal for putting the nerd emoji front row center on that because reasons. I've kind of fit the nerd profile anyway. So how do you get the genetic data? Very simple. It's a little tiny cheek swab. It is so easy. There's no blood, there's no urine, there's no spitting, there's no stool sample. It's super easy. And thank you, Crystal, for putting my my link into my YouTube channel for the Asperger's. Watch it, not now, but you can watch it later. It's very simple. It takes less than 5 minutes. And the good news about genetics is that it's not like genetics testing is not like functional testing, like adrenal, stool, mitochondria, food allergies, etc. It's you don't have to get tested again. If you once you get the data, like their genes don't change. So I really wanted to find the genetics company that was cutting edge, and I'm one of the few practitioners in that are trained in this methodology. In fact, you can't even get one of these profiles through your 23andMe and Ancestry.com because it's looking at a different phenomenon of genetics, not variations, but duplicates or copy numbers. So there's an entire set of genetics related to diet that isn't available except through trained practitioners such as myself. And you can't get it through, the big boys, the 23andMe's and the Ancestries. So what to do now? Great question, because genetic testing is a huge, immense interest for my community. When I talk about genetically determining your optimal diet, I very rarely have someone not had their ears perk up. So what we've done for the beginning of this year, this is right now, this is recorded in January, very beginning of the year, we are making it easier for you and your loved ones to get tested. So this has literally not happened before, partly because one of these profiles is brand new. One of these diet related profiles is brand new, not even available to the public yet. It's like I'm like in the first wave of this new diet profile being made available. And it's really worth getting your genes tested because it's never been easier before. And now on sale is the Find Your Ideal Diet. So this is that carb tolerance sale. This is that carb tolerance that I was talking about. This is the genetic test that genetically determined, are you keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb? So I thought I was Mediterranean because that's what all the quote research said. But here's the thing about research on population levels when it comes to health and diet. It's a bell curve. So there's a meaningful percentage of people who are Mediterranean diet that are right kind of in the middle of that bell curve, but there's a bunch of people to either side of it, including me, who are on the lower carb side of that bell curve. So I found out that I was genetically best suited for paleo, not Mediterranean. And that within 1 week changed my entire digestive function after suffering for 20 years. So genetic testing will take all the guesswork out of the diet that you're trying to figure out. And the best part is that we are now combining, you get the ideal diet genetics test, and I'm going to give you for free the trigger foods profile and this brand new one that's just being not even available to the public yet, is Rewire Your Eating Behaviors. This one is just coming out. I love this profile. It is so fascinating. So here's the summary of all of them. So the Find Your Ideal Diet. This is the one that determines the big picture. Are you a keto? Are you more optimally suited for keto, paleo, Mediterranean, or high carb? The next thing is the trigger foods. Now there are 5, and they've also recently added 2 more. One is your relationship to gluten, your relationship to lactose or dairy, alcohol, caffeine, and salt. So for example, will coffee induce anxiety and depression? Now, for me, I have what's called a red dot. Like I am a double negative variant genetically, where coffee will give me anxiety and depression. No matter how much coconut oil or cinnamon or how bulletproofy that coffee is, coffee messes me up. And genetically, and I was denying it because all the podcasts said, if you just put MCT oil and coconut oil in your coffee, every life is going to be grand and your brain's going to wake up. No, not for me. And I think it's about 10 to 20% of the population has this gene variant. So once I saw my genes, I've suddenly, the veil was lifted, and I finally, you know, reflected on my life experience around coffee. It's like, yeah, I was in denial. And so I've cut out coffee. Missed the flavor for sure, but my life is way, way better. And I wouldn't have made that leap without seeing the inarguable genetic data in front of me. Alcohol, you can check for your genetic risk for alcoholism. Are you lactose intolerant? And are you at risk for celiac disease from gluten? Will salt likely raise your blood pressure? And then there's also two more, which is, are you genetically sensitive to histamines? And then other food allergens, whether the big seven, like soy, eggs, fish, peanuts, etc. Then this last profile, brand new, really excited, love the image of the apple with the donuts, is eating behavior. So this is about helping you rewire your genetic predispositions to eating behavior by changing your environment so that you can make more easeful choices. And because you'll now know genetically, are you more genetically wired to just feel hungrier overall, or like satiety? That's the word, satiation. Your ability to control your appetite, bitter taste perception, sweet taste perception, sugar consumption, fat taste perception, and response to fat intake. And I want to focus on one as one example, bitter taste perception. So this I did not know until I studied this profile. So if you have a particular genetic variant where you are way more sensitive to the taste of bitter, you will on average eat 200 pounds fewer vegetables per year if you have this genetic variant, because things taste more bitter. Some of you may know people that cilantro tastes like soap. Like, and that I have a brother-in-law that has that genetic variant. So he like will not have cilantro because he doesn't, you know, like soap in his mouth. So it's on that continuum where if you are genetically already vulnerable to having certain foods taste poorly, you will unconsciously and consciously avoid those foods or foods related to those types of foods. That's where people can end up just eating 200 pounds fewer vegetables per year. So if you know that, now you are aware of, oh, I have okay, then you can alter consciously your eating environment to figure out how to include more vegetables in a palatable way, as opposed to just by default avoiding. So that's just one example. Then there's other things in here about how to look at your sugar consumption, fat taste perception, like how you respond to fat, how you respond to sugar, et cetera, et cetera. So these 3 tests for the price of 1. For to get the ideal diet, you get these other 2. And so here is the sale. Okay, I've never done this before. This has never been available. Ideal diet, value $747, trigger foods $5.99, rewire eating behaviors $3.99, normal pricing is $17.45, 57% off, it's $747 for all of it, all 3 of these. And again, these are genetics tests. The results do not change. You now have this information for life. I see a question about, if that's related to this, does the trigger foods measure our response to casein in dairy? So that's an excellent question. So there are 3 actual three common things in dairy that can create immune responses. So one is lactose. The other is, well, lactose, it's not necessarily an immune response, it's a lack of an enzyme, but then can create problems in the gut, which then it can have its own downstream immune responses. So there's the lactose issue, then there's casein, and then there's whey, which is your response to the 2 milk proteins. Lactose is a milk sugar. This genetic test does not test for casein. It does check for lactose. Now, that's what's relevant is that I've never been able to really have dairy, and my mother bought the expensive Lactaid, bought lactated milk that was, and I was still having problems with drinking milk, even though we had like the lactose enzymes and all the rest of it. Now, when I did my trigger foods, this one, I came up green dot for lactose, meaning that I had the gene to digest lactose. So why was I still struggling with dairy if in theory I could have lactose? Because when I did food allergen testing that wasn't related to, that's not on the genetics test as of yet, I was reactive to casein and whey, which explained why the lactate milk didn't help me. The lactate enzymes didn't help me because it was the other allergenic proteins, casein and whey, that I was reactive to that were also in the milk, whether there was lactose sugar in it or not. So excellent question. If people have, like I have a green dot in lactose, but I still can't do dairy. I can do ghee, which is free of the milk proteins, including casein and whey, and free of the milk sugar, lactose, which is not a really issue for me anyway. So the genetics of food triggers is going to continue to grow. Currently, we've got lactose in here, and that one solved a hugely frustrating mystery for me and my mother as to why I couldn't have dairy even though I had the lactate milk. So again, I've never run this special before, ever. And you're going to get these 3 tests. You only have to test them once. So you just think of the investment, $747. If you plan on living another 30 years minimum, 30 years minimum, I'm just doing a quick calculation here because I haven't, I should have done this calculation before, but it just never crossed my mind. So that's spending $24.90 a year. So that's under $25 a year amortized over 30 years to have these genetic information laid out for life. So if, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly willing to spend less than $25 a year over the next 30 years to get my genetics for my diet stuff like figured out in a major meaningful way. So here is the link. Crystal also put the link in the chat. So it's bit.ly/ideal diet sale. It's capital K. So the I in ideal, the D in diet, and the S in sale are all capitalized. That's important because bit.ly, the bit.ly links, they're case sensitive. So just FYI. Now that's the sale. Again, never done this before. I'm very, very excited to offer this, particularly because of this brand new rewire your eating behaviors. That to me is really, really exciting. And when you do click on the link, you'll be sent to this page. So you know what you're looking at. You can pay with credit card, you can pay with PayPal. If you like, you've got all sorts of options. This is what it will look like. And the end goal is that you can leverage genetic testing so you can live in harmony with your body. Once you know what your genetic foundational templates are, what you know your trigger foods are, and what you know what your genetic food behaviors are, you are now working in partnership and collaboration with your body as opposed to in a kind of a combative relationship. I had a very, 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 very combative relationship with my body growing up, especially around food, because it felt like no matter what I ate, I'd feel unwell, have digestive problems, be gassy, look sickly, have low energy, and it wasn't getting any answers. And genetics just completely revealed so much of what had been missing for decades. And I would have paid easily 5 figures for this information 20 years ago, easily 5 figures, if I could have spared me 20 plus years of just agony and embarrassment. So I want to open up for Q&A. I want to see what people have for questions, whether it's questions about the different profiles, whether it's questions about diet in general, questions about genetics. What is it that people would like? What would people like to know? Now, I'm seeing that there's a question near the top. Does the rectangular shape mean no curve at the waistline? So the rectangular shape means that the waistline around the belly button is no longer hourglassy. Like it's just kind of the waist that if you draw a horizontal line from the belly button, which would be the supposed to be the thinnest part there, that it's filled out so it's in line with the width of the hips. And then someone wrote a question that just says carrot. So not quite sure what that question was about. Debbie, if you want to clarify what you mean by carrot. And any other questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. for the name of the robot? You want me to name the robot Carrot? I can do that. Okay, we can or maybe carrot shape. Is that what you're talking about? I don't know. I never thought of naming my cartoon representations of the body shapes. Carrot, large. Okay, yes, carrot, larger on top and smaller on carrot shape. Interesting. Okay, I will take that into consideration. Carrot shape. Thank you, Debbie. I like the collaboration on finding different visual representations. That's great. So a question also: does diet requirement change with age or menopause? Okay, so that's an excellent question. So there's actually five layers to determining diet. Genetics is one layer. So the foundational